it wasn't an easy choice going in last time through. And frankly, one of the things we still have a hard time, we still struggle with is differentiating you guys. So what I'd really like you guys to start out doing, and let's start with you, Rob, is I really want to understand how you see yourself as different, where you see the distinctions between the two of you, and why we should care about those issues that you see that are distinguishable.
Great question, thank you. I think the distinctions between the two candidates in this race are as follows, at least from my perspective.
Mm-hmm.
One is, I think that as a publicly elected official, I have a broader spectrum of experience in the policy areas that are important to the district. In the areas that I've been talking about, I have direct first-hand experience in, and I have experience being effective in those areas. So public education, K through 12, revitalizing the economy and job creation, public safety, ensuring we have a strong, secure social service safety net. Those have been my top 4 priorities since day one of this campaign.
Public education, K-12, revitalizing the economy.
Public safety.
Public safety.
Social service safety net.
Okay, social service. Okay, so I'm gonna be real specific with you guys because we've been through this, you know. Help me understand where that leads in terms of public policy issues in Sacramento. How are your votes likely to be different than Abel's?
Right. Well, I was the only person ever in this campaign who was talking about public safety. So that's going to be a top priority to me. It's going to mean I'm going to focus on things related to police patrol, fire suppression, emergency medical response, and just no one else has been talking about that. So in terms of votes, priorities, I'm going to be potentially, if I'm elected, would like to consider being on a public safety committee. I'll be talking about issues like the Emergency Prevention Fund, which would be a creation of a state fund to help fight crime in areas that are facing spikes in violent crime. No one else has talked about that in this race. I think it's critical to this district. It's certainly critical to certain parts of Oakland where there are rising violent crime rates in the face of cuts to about 25% to the police department. So I think that makes me very unique. I think that also public safety is not just important inherently, but it's important to the health of our revitalizing economy, to the health of business investment, desire to invest in this district, in Oakland. The real or perceived public safety concerns have, we've seen it, have led businesses to not want to expand in Oakland or to leave their operations altogether. So I think that my public safety focus goes hand in hand with business investment and job creation and economic revitalization. I'm interested, switching gears from public safety, I think my votes are in Sacramento are going to be geared towards supporting small businesses, creating new firm opportunities, new business opportunities that will create jobs here in the district. Creating opportunities for access to capital for small businesses. One idea I've talked about a lot, which really affects this district and districts throughout the state, is a bill that would create a carve-out for former military properties for what was abolished as part of redevelopment agencies and redevelopment law. So making tax increment financing available again in former military properties to help with base conversion throughout the state and certainly within the district, at Oakland Army Base, at Oakland Naval Hospital, at Alameda Point, where those properties can be integrated into the economy, into the community, to create jobs. So no one had been talking about those types of ideas. I think again, job creation, economic revitalization, public safety are areas that I've had experience with, that I've talked about, that would be priorities for me. And then K-12 education, absolutely critical to make sure we have sufficient levels of funding. We all know we've gone from one of the top 10 states in the country in per pupil school funding to almost dead last right now. I think we're 47th. That's an area of my own personal concern as a husband and a father of 3. And I've not only helped raise $84 million for East Bay Public Schools through a parcel tax, but I've joined a statewide consortium of advocates to try to make sure that we have adequate school funding. And again, that plays into the broader infrastructure concerns that we have in California to help make sure we have, that we create jobs, that we revitalize the economy, that we are educating our next group of employees and entrepreneurs and business owners.
Bill?
So,
Yeah, so I think what distinguishes me is that I've actually been in the trenches doing the work. I've been in the Peralta Community College Board for 6 years, going on 7. I had the pleasure of being endorsed by the Oakland Tribune, and in that editorial, my financial expertise and background was cited. And as someone who can ask the tough questions, I lived up to those promises. I've stood up to the administration, challenged the district on a lot of financial issues, and really have a track record that I'm proud of. I've had to deal with infrastructure issues, education policy issues, finance, healthcare, transportation issues. These are all areas that have given me a really broad breadth of experience at the Peralta colleges. My whole goal has been to provide educational access and opportunities, but the reason I'm taking this job now is because the state hasn't had its priorities straight. We need someone in Sacramento who's rooted in the community and who has a track record of getting things done, and not somebody who just talks.
Okay, give me policy. Same thing I said to Rob. Give me policy differences.
Right, so the policy differences. One is around community college issues. I think community colleges are the workforce of California's economic engine, and we've disinvested in our community colleges to the tune of turning away 650,000 students. If we're going to get California back on track, that's the most cost-efficient investment we can make. Number 2, in terms of education, for our school districts, we need to figure out how to give better incentives to create pipeline and create ways that our community colleges, our high school districts can work together. I was proud to champion the Gateway to College program that really addresses the dropout issue in Oakland Unified. In Oakland Unified, when students drop out, there isn't really any mechanism or place for them to go. We need to support programs like that really allow students that, for whatever reason, K-12 didn't work for them, dropped out, and let them capture ADA funds to make sure that those dollars are recouped and provide the services at the community college level. Open and transparent government is a big issue for me. At Peralta, transparency was a bit dark. And over the years, I've put in policies in place. One of the things that I championed was making sure all our meetings are actually online and open and accessible. I think government ought to know who are donors, so I'm a big supporter of Disclosure Act to make sure that people know who's contributing to the campaigns.
You realize we don't think a lot of Peralta's transparency to date. I mean,
it's a lot more transparent, I'll tell you that much.
It's got a long ways to go.
Yeah, and we're still working on that. But I'm proud of the fact that we opened up, we have a new chancellor in place. That was a decision that happened under my watch as a trustee. It wasn't an easy decision, but with my leadership, I was able to bring the board together and get stuff done. In terms of healthcare is a big issue in California. I think that under Affordable Care Act, we need to make sure that it's implemented properly and strive towards single-payer healthcare. I think we need to take out part of the reason we have skyrocketing healthcare costs, not only in our pension system, but for employers, is because we have skyrocketing healthcare costs. There's so many dollars that are wasted. If we had a single-payer system of healthcare, I think it would go a long way to increase coverage here in California, but also make it a more productive business climate for our employers.
Okay, so let me understand, guys, and I hear what you guys are saying. You know, frankly, the general goals are all wonderful, and I don't think that anybody would disagree with either of your general goals. But we got a state that's a real mess. You know, so I guess what I'd like to hear is I'd like to first hear really succinctly some real clear discussion of what the priority should be. How do we get out of this mess?
Well, let's take it a step further.
Okay.
Let's assume for a moment that this tax is not going to pass. And I think that's a realistic assumption. I'm not saying it won't, but I'm saying that there's a good chance that it won't. if the Browns tax doesn't pass, you will be in the legislature right in the crosshairs. Both of you, whoever's there, you're asking for this. What would you cut? Because you're going to have to make massive cuts from what you have now. If you think K through 12 is bad now, just wait. So tell me how you would go about, what would be your, I realize, you're one of 120, but what would be your ultimate descending priorities? What would have to be funded, followed by what are your top 3, 4 priorities that you have to have? Bill?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And one of the things that I would want to use is really, I think the legislature needs to tap into the skills of the LAO and really get down and drill down. Where do we get our most bang for our buck? If you put in $1 into education, let's say community colleges, and you get a $5 investment in return, that's a pretty good deal. So we need to look at the numbers and figure out what's effective. Areas that I would cut, what are some areas of duplication that are out there? I'll give you an example. The state of California has a FDA, a state FDA, a Food and Drug Administration. The federal government has a Food and Drug Administration that regulates all food and drugs here in California. That's an area of duplication as far as I'm concerned, and probably doesn't need to be in place. So I'm sure there are other areas such as that we need to look at and say, hey, where doesn't it make sense to have the state agency and then drill down to the basics of what we really ought to be doing, what is being done, where there's duplication, and tackling those issues. That would be one priority. I think the things that we need to really look at also are, our properties in the state of California. You've got state parks that are holding on to $50 million. What's that about? How is that even possible? And I think each agency needs to go through a particular type of audit to figure out if the books are actually correct or not. I don't think that's happened in a systematic way. I think the state parks are just one example of that, and I think there's probably a lot more of that could be uncovered.
Rob?
Yeah. So one of the reasons that I got into this race, and I was the last person to get into this race, is because no candidate was talking about K-12 education and public safety, what I believe are the two most important issues facing this district. So those are going to be among my top priorities every time there's a budget or an issue of tough decisions when focusing on priorities. I think there is a number of ways that we can try to find savings, and we're going to be in a real pinch if the governor's compromise revenue package doesn't pass, because it's going to trigger a whole bunch of other cuts in areas that we don't want. But certainly where there are areas of duplication and redundancy from the different layers of government, we need to think about consolidation.
Such as?
And making things smaller. The regulatory regime, if we have county bodies doing the same as state bodies for employee safety or for environmental regulation, we need to think about taking away those regulatory bodies. Sorry?
You said if we do we?
I think we absolutely. Our multiple layers of government do not always interplay well. The state has control over its own regulatory regime. Counties theirs, federal theirs, cities theirs. So we need to make sure that the goal of the regulation is being achieved, but not being done with government that's oversized and bloated and unnecessary. But beyond that, I think a couple other areas where we could find some savings. One, for me, in the prison system. I think we have invested over the years too much in the prison system to the detriment of other top priorities for me, K-12 education, social services, among them. I think that we can think about more cost recovery services. For example, in our park system, I think we could think about increasing some of the fees for usage so that there's more cost recovery and you could still sustain the service or only affect it minimally while not affecting the budget. And then finally,
so they could have $100 million that they could find?
It's not the biggest ticket item. I agree.
I know, but I mean, you're picking out parks, and the Parks Department just found $50 million, and now we want to give them more money? Is that what you're saying?
No. The opposite. They would be getting less money from the government and more money through cost recovery from the users of the park. So it wouldn't be an outlay of government funds. So, and then we could try to use that model in other places to try to recover costs. And then finally, look, on pensions. We talked about that in the past. That's been an issue of ongoing discussion for all of us. I think we need to do two things. One is, I think we need to have a realistic anticipated rate of return, one that really is going to create sustainable pensions so that the pensions are there at the end of the day. I think pensions promised are owed, and part of making sure that they're there at the end is making sure that we have a rate of return that's realistic and the funding that's appropriate for the pension. So that is going to necessarily mean, especially in today's climate, when the rate was 7.75, is now 7.5, and the actual rate of return is 1%, that employees and employers are going to have to talk more about how they're going to fund those pensions. And in the city of Alameda, we buy into CalPERS, and we have a cap on what employees can pay. On the public safety side, it's 9%. We have a cap on what miscellaneous employees can pay, it's 7%. We asked for special dispensation after negotiations with our public safety units to increase by 22% that contribution by public safety employees. So it went from 9% to 11%. There's still more room to increase that contribution.
When you say special dispensation, what did that involve?
We had applied to, it was a set of papers that we had to file with the California, with CalPERS. It was they're granted as a matter of course, but we couldn't do it without asking and being granted permission. Same thing, we just increased for miscellaneous employees from 7%, another 1.86% through the good faith collective bargaining process, which I think is the right way to do it. And we asked them to help contribute to a solution to our problem, and they agreed. So we're doing it both on the public safety side and on the public miscellaneous.
Where's the realistic
employee
rate
side.
of return for you, in your mind?
Like a bond rate, I think something really conservative that you're going to hit. I think that's right. And if you do beat it, then you can factor that into the future. But as an ex post facto calculation, not ex ante. So it happens after you actually hit the mark of beating the conservative rate of return. And so, I think employees and employers need to have an ongoing discussion about how they're going to continue to fund their pensions so that they are there as promised for employees at the end of the day. And it might mean increasing the caps so that through the good faith collective bargaining process, that discussion can be had. And so I think that will shift the burden away from the government right now for some of these pension plans that are unsustainable.
Bill, what do you think of what Rob has just talked about in terms of?
Well, I think we need a more independent CalPERS board. I think if we have some sort of model, we need a different approach, because the policy making board, I think there's a lot of interest involved there, and if there's some way we can make it more independent, akin to maybe the UC Regents, where they have 12-year terms, longer terms, are more insulated from sort of political biases. I think that would be a step in the right direction.
But at the core, there's still a group of people selected to represent very specific special interests.
Mm-hmm. So,
which is problematic. And I'm saying we need to figure out how to make it more independent so that it's not at the whim of political appointments. What do you think a realistic rate of return is?
I think the state of California right now tends to look at a 20-year rate of return, which is like 7.5%. I think those expectations should be looked at in a much shorter term and then reset on an ongoing basis. So I think a more realistic rate of return for a 10-year period is closer to 5 or 6% return on investment. This 1 year, over the last 3 years, I think it was about 5 or 6%, and over 10 years, I think it's something similar to that.
So do I hear from both of you that if either of you is elected, the first bill you'll be putting in is to impose a bond rate standard on pension financing?
I'll start that discussion, absolutely. I think we need to. I've talked in the past about some of the first two bills that I would pass, and I alluded to both of them today. The Emergency Prevention Fund for public safety and the carve-out for military properties for tax increment financing. But I think that discussion has to occur, and I think, you know, what I've always said is that addressing the pension challenges is gonna occur at the table at at the different governmental entities' locations. So not every public union and every pension challenge is created equally. Some are more dire and more immediate and need attention. Some are more sustainable. So, you know, for public safety employees, the expenses just based on the formula and their salaries are higher. And so those discussions need to occur. And I think a conservative rate of return is a very important first step.
I don't think that's my first bill. I'll just be honest with you. There's a $400 billion unfunded liability at the table, but there's a lot of case law involved in these issues, and I don't think a bill is going to get there immediately. I think it needs to be negotiated, and you need to have the data. You need to figure out, you need to look at the actuaries, figure out if people are living longer. You need the data to make informed decisions. So I don't presume to go up to Sacramento on day one and solve the pension problem. But I certainly have the skill set in order to ask tough questions and make sure we get answers to those questions.
I'll also add that another component to a bill that addresses pensions would be one that doesn't allow for the skimming of quote-unquote excess returns away for other expenses that the city wants to use or the entity wants to use, and make sure that they stay in the investment. So if there's a rate of return and it quote unquote, you know, beats the target for the year, and then it's taken away from the pension fund and used for other expenses.
Okay,
like,
so you don't want pension holidays?
Yes.
Or excess earnings?
That's right.
I think everybody agrees at this point, in retrospect, that's a bad idea, right?
Hopefully.
Yeah.
The other piece that's important, I think, is that you know, everyone needs to have a stake in the game in the process. People are blind to investments because it's just happening on their own, but that's not realistic anymore. You know, and I think everyone involved needs to have a stake in the game, not only the taxpayers but also the employees, and they need to be make sure that they have a stake in whatever policy is set up. So they need to be at the table for that discussion.
Well, employees will tell you they're taxpayers, so they already have a stake in the game.
They are taxpayers, but you know, if it comes at the expense of other public education, other entities, they need to be aware of that, what it's going to do to the state of public education, for example, or other social services that the state is also responsible for.
So I guess the question then is, it would be wonderful for everybody to have a stake, have a seat at the table and a stake in the game. Or, as we've said, skin in the game. What is the policy alternative that gives public employees skin in the game?
I think if there's a model, if you set up a model where expectations are rosier or returns are rosier than predicted, maybe that 9% or 7% for school teachers is reduced or increased at that point.
Let me be real specific. Governor's proposal, which we'll see whether this was part of what comes out in the next few weeks. The governor's proposal calls for a 50-50 split of the normal cost. Good idea, bad idea?
I think it's a reasonable first step.
Rob? Good idea or bad idea? 50-50 split of the normal.
I think moving towards that is a good idea. I think CalPERS doesn't allow for that right now. We couldn't do that if we wanted to right now in the city of Alameda with our public safety employees. So that's why I said some of those caps, they need to be increased or removed, so that can be part of the discussion. And then again, as I've always said, the final decision needs to be made at the good faith collective bargaining table. But I think that needs to be a possibility so that discussion can be had.
Okay. In our discussion here, do you both understand what I mean by 50-50 split of the normal cost?
You're saying that 50% of the total cost, in terms of total compensation, not their salary, but what's put into retirement, half that cost is split both by the state, half the contribution is put in by the state and half the other cost is put in by the employer.
Yeah, for the contributions that are made every year, for the pension fund, 50% is being borne by the employees, 50% is being borne by the employers.
Well, there's two parts of the annual contributions, right? There's two elements to the amount that is contributed each year.
There's the employer portion, and then there's
Well,
the
okay, then
employee portion.
the calculation of the total amount that goes in each year has two components, two key components. I feel like
The salary, the total compensation.
No, there is the ongoing cost, and then there's the contribution for the unfunded liability.
Right.
Okay, does this
Yep.
make sense?
Right.
Okay. So what are we talking about? Are you guys, does that help you guys understand what my question is and what the governor's proposing?
My understanding is that for those two components,
Mhm.
you have grand total, and then the 50% is borne by the employee, 50% is borne by the employer.
There is a portion, I guess, that hasn't, that currently isn't being paid, which is the unfunded portion liability. And I believe that there are some bargaining units out there that have started actually setting aside some of those funds to pay down the unfunded liability portion. It's gonna take a long time though, under the current
What the
system.
governor's proposing, which is something we had editorially advocated a year ago, is that the ongoing cost, the going forward cost, the amount that you need to contribute this year for the new pension benefits earned this year, and that is the normal cost by definition, would be split 50-50. The unfunded liability portion would remain as an employer burden. So for example, public safety right now is roughly about, on average for CalPERS, if I remember the numbers, it's about 35 cents on the dollar of payroll for the normal cost, and it's about an additional 10 cents on the dollar, expected to go to about 15 for the unfunded liability. What the governor would be proposing in that case is splitting the 35 cents 50-50. Good idea or bad idea?
My answer remains the same. Yes, but not the top-down approach. I think it needs to be made available to every bargaining unit
What do you mean?
through negotiations.
Made available.
So, the caps that CalPERS currently has in place that does not allow for that
Mhm.
needs to be increased or removed, so that's at least possible. And then the bargaining units can have that discussion with their management groups and, in public safety units across the state.
Well,
It's a little bit different definition than that, as I understood it. So I don't know. I need to look at it more closely. And I know that's not what you want to hear, but that's the truth.
we talked about this, and then we probably want to wrap up shortly. We're not going to let this go more than about 45 minutes. We talked about this last time a little bit prospectively, now retrospectively. Was high-speed rail, the decision that the legislature and the governor ultimately made, a good idea or a bad idea?
I think the legislator decided, and I think it's probably building a track from Madero to Fresno. That isn't the big population center of California, so I'm not sure that's the best way of approaching the issue at this point in time. But I think it's the train's left the station, as they say.
Well, let me ask you, if you'd been there, how would you have voted?
I think I would have voted to to wait on the high-speed rail at this time, or punt it for a while. Because the coffers aren't there. I mean, we have a budget that's based on the Facebook IPO of $1.9 billion that isn't gonna materialize. I mean, you know, we're playing with all these imaginary numbers up there, these budgets that aren't based in reality, and we need a dose of reality up in Sacramento. It's a great idea, but it's just not too rich for this point in time.
Rob?
I wouldn't have voted for it this time. I do continue to believe it's a good idea worth pursuing, but the original promise and the original contours of what high-speed rail would look like, what its cost would be, what its ridership would be, when it would come online, those all changed. It is a different high-speed rail that was voted on than was promised when the prop passed. So the price went up from $45 billion to $69 billion. The ridership went down. The date for when the build-out would occur was pushed back. The instead of San Diego to Sacramento, it's LA to San Francisco. So there were a lot of changes, and it is expensive. It adds to the ongoing burden of payment out of the general fund for debt service in a time when we're facing some very difficult choices that are important to me, like the social service safety net, like cuts to CalWorks and in-home support services and child care for the needy. So I wouldn't have done it now. People talk about the federal funding that you lose by not moving forward now, and it's significant, but in the grand scheme of things, when you take the entire price tag, I think it was $3.3 billion compared to the $69 billion complete total price tag. It's not the biggest amount in the world, and so on balance, I would have voted against for now and delayed for a later time when hopefully some of those challenges that I just outlined would be addressed.
You may end up considering one last thing that we didn't talk about, I don't think, the last time. And since we last talked, the governor's unveiled a plan for the Delta. What are your thoughts on that, on the governor's plan, Rob?
So
The tunnel of water under Delta.
Yeah, I mean, the water bonds and the plans on water, I think, have always been challenging for me to support for a number of reasons. And environmental reasons are one, that the increased cost for of debt service in a time when the general funds, every dollar is so valuable for other services. And then, I think we need to have more of a system and a concept of user pays rather than every Californian pays. So those are some of the challenges and criticisms that I have.
Okay.
I think it's part of he's trying to find his legacy project, if you will, and it's not a new idea. It was an idea that was brought forth in the 70s or 80s. Let's face it, the population of California is going to be nearing 50 million people, and we need a reliable water source. I'm not sure that solution is the best solution, this underground tunnel. I'm not even aware what the costs are at this point. But the truth of the matter is that
Nothing compared to high speed.
The truth of the matter is that we need to start preparing and thinking about water as a basic need here in California with many competing interests, and it's something that ought to be looked at. But under this environment, I'm not sure we can go down that path.
So and let's go reverse here, about what is the solution to the state's water situation?
I think certainly conservation efforts are part of it. I think we need to stop developing out in the desert, in the Inland Empire and places like that. I think that there is a natural water source there, and we ought to put policies in place that really where we focus on infill development, where there isn't so much sprawl. I think that looking at agriculture has to be part of that equation as well. it can only be conservation, but it also needs to be, good planning at the end of the day. I don't know if the current aqueduct that we have in place, if that can be a basis for being expanded or putting more water through the current aqueduct in place to get water to where it's needed in the population centers of California.
Rob?
It's obviously it's a tough question. I think there's multiple areas where we can make progress and help contribute to the solution. One definitely is conservation and reducing usage. One of the biggest users is the Central Valley for sure, and trying to find ways to be more efficient. Technology, I think, has promise for part of the solution. Conversion of salinated water and desalination technologies, I think, could be part of the answer. There could be a component where it involves compacts between other states, not just a pure California solution. And then the California solution, I think, needs to be one where, as I mentioned,
We already rob water from other states.
I know. So, renegotiating the compacts or, finding ways to do it.
It's not gonna end up
expensive.
with more water, certainly. Those are the other states resent us greatly for that.
Right, it's worth exploring. I think looking outside of the state as well to see if any part of the solution comes from there, or reduces the problem here. And then for the intra-California solution, I think, again, user pays, I think, has to be a big part of the solution. It needs to be one that doesn't create massive challenges for the general fund, and then one that has the smallest impact, negative environmental impact. So I don't see that in some of the current plans.
Okay, let's just wrap up real quickly, and I think let's start with you, Abel. I want you to take me back. I want to go back to the first question we asked, and I want you to just give me 2 policies on which, now that we've been through all this, on which you differ, policies in which you see you differ from Rob.
So I think that in terms of policies where I differ is that I believe that education, I go back to education, that if we don't make the right investments today in education, there's no way we're going to get out of this economic slump. I believe that going forward, the policy differences between me and my opponent are that I'm not the guy who's just going to be willing to go along to get along. I'm going to be the person who's going to look at the data and try to make the best decision that's going to be based for the constituents of our district and for the state of California. I think that I think that job investment and career training are going to be vital to getting California back on track, and I think that's what we need to focus on at the end of the day.
Okay, let me just ask you one thing.
Yeah.
Tell me exactly on the Peralta board where you have not gone along to get along and where you have made change policy in a significant way.
I'll tell you one thing right off the bat. At Peralta, in response to the foreclosure crisis, I passed a resolution to divest our taxpayer dollars from the big banks, and that's a direct response from our communities. And I got a lot of pressure saying, Abel, you're running for office, you shouldn't be taking up the big banks, but it was the right thing to do. We have $140 million in state taxpayer dollars, and we needed to make sure, I wanted to make sure that those funds were being used in a manner that was not only good for our community, but represented the needs of our students. So I did a resolution to divest those funds from the big banks and put those funds into local community banks and credit unions that create jobs. It took me a while to get the board on the entire board to get on board. The administration told me not to do it, but I convinced the board that it was the right thing to do for our community. I got called up to Sacramento by the big banks to help them educate me on why it was such a bad idea, but at the end of the day, it was the right thing to do. Also, I was the president when we changed the chancellor.
You changed the chancellor.
Yes. I made the resolution. I put the resolution forward to make a motion to actually start the chancellor search, and that wasn't an easy thing to do. There was a lot of controversy, I know.
Well, by that point, to start the search, at that point, the chancellor was clearly on his way out, right? He clearly was, his
But it was a
contract not-
decision.
Everybody was in agreement, were they not?
No, they
No?
weren't.
Okay.
They
tell
weren't,
me
and it
that.
was a decision that needed to be made like a year earlier.
Mhm.
And it wasn't until I became board president that I got the votes to make that happen. This wasn't a decision. It wasn't a decision that happened lightly and easily. It wasn't unanimous at the beginning. It should have happened 6 months ago, if not a year earlier.
So, are you saying that you were the driving force behind getting the
I'm
last
saying
chancellor
that
out?
I'm saying that I made sure that our CFO was terminated, and made sure that we brought in started the search process for a new chancellor. And that happened under my watch. And a lot of it is because I convinced my colleagues on the board that our finances weren't right. Our books were cooked, I felt like. And started asking those tough questions. And lo and behold, we asked assistants from FIGMAT to come in and to take a look at that. And sure enough,
Yeah, but you were a vote on that board, and what, I mean, I get it that you were president, but that's pretty much a ceremonial post, if you will. You had a vote all along, and you guys had closed sessions. Why were you not able earlier to persuade?
as board president, you get to set the agenda. And as board president, I set the agenda to make that happen. It's not ceremonial.
Why then does the Peralta board not allow any board member to raise an issue? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying, no, not at all. I think it's a different culture, it's a different place. We don't have, I think we're a lot more open than we used to be, a lot more
Okay, but that's not the question I'm asking.
Mhm.
I guess you say as board president, you get to set the agenda. The
Right.
implication of that is that if a board member does not have,
Yeah, no,
If a board
anybody gets
member-
to put a proposal forward.
okay,
You
so.
don't have to be the board president.
Okay,
Yeah.
so then I come back to, why didn't you do it a year earlier?
Because you need to build up, you need to make sure you have the votes in place to make it happen.
Okay. Rob, policy differences, between you and Abel?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think a lot is different from what I said in my opening comments. I talked about the importance of public safety to this district and to me. I talked about the importance of K-12 education to the district and to me.
Yeah, but what are the policy differences you see between the
Right.
two?
I mean, I still haven't heard anything from my opponent about either of those topics. For policy, I have specific policies for my different priorities. One, public safety. I've talked about my emergency prevention fund. I think we have a common responsibility, no matter what level of government you are at. Even though cities have traditionally taken on the role of providing public safety services and funding them, I think the state as well has a responsibility to make sure our communities live in safety. So the emergency prevention fund is something that no one has ever talked about. Makes me different than my current opponent, maybe different than all my prior opponents. I've also talked about the carve out for tax increment financing, hugely important to this district. No one else has talked about it. I've also talked about the importance of small businesses, of bringing in new firms that can create new jobs.
Let me interrupt you for a second.
So,
The ideas you're putting out there for the most part sound like fine ideas and all, although some might argue about the tax increment financing carve out. But they require more money. You're not gonna have more money. My question is, what are the policy differences in an environment that you will be facing of reductions, not increases?
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
I mean, those are campaign pitches. I get that. My question, though, is policy differences within, frankly, the real world of what you're gonna face.
Right, right. Well, I mentioned some of those already. You heard my views on pensions and how to reduce costs there. And what the appropriate process is and what I think some of the important pressure points are for how to make real change. So you've heard about that, and I think I'm different than my opponent in that regard. Revitalizing the economy and job creation, those are things people talk about in generalities, but I think that we can really make some progress with small businesses, which are responsible for 60 to 80% of new jobs. And that we can, have the endorsement of the California Small Business Association that is a job creator. I think by doing two things, creating access to capital that's affordable, and also by providing ongoing technical assistance, we can help our future entrepreneurs, our small business owners create new jobs, create new firms, and really help. That will actually create new revenue for obviously for the state of California. As people get back to work, they'll spend more money. That will generate sales tax income. They'll have higher personal income tax, and without changing the tax rates, just by increasing the tax base, it'll be helping create more funding for the services that we care about. I think that's very important. No one has talked about that in this race, about real ways to help create jobs. I think that lies with small businesses and assistance to them.
Gentlemen, thank
Thanks.
you very much.
Thank you
We
very
very
much.
much appreciate it.
Thank you.